Welcome back to Get Mac. We're going to continue our class about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So if you hopefully watched the first video, and I'm just going to pretty much continue to roll from where we stopped. Okay, so we just talked about the potential GDP curve being as the most efficient level of production in the current scenario that an economy faces, right? Which we equals the in terms of unemployment, we just talked about equaling the natural rate of unemployment, right? So you start to see a connection between the unemployment and the price level and the aggregate supply curve here. Okay, and the first step to see that is just start to notice, given that we're in a certain point in an economy. So let's pretend here that we're producing at Y1. Okay, so that's the current production. Then we know that there's a gap that we can see here, right? There's a gap between the current level of production Y1 and the so wanted efficient level of production potential GDP, which is Y star. Okay, so that gap is a negative in this case because the formula for the GDP gap is going to be the current level of consumption minus where we want to get. Okay, so since we know that Y star is bigger, how? Because it's further along in the Y-axis, in the X-axis, right? Then that means now that this number is going to be negative. So whenever we see the assumption here, whenever we see GDP gap that is negative, that means unemployment is higher than what is supposed to be right now. Okay, so there's a lot of people unemployed. Okay, so let's now connect how is this level of unemployment and scarcity of resources connected with the shape of this curve. So we understand now why it's positive slope, because we know that we're assuming here that the input prices are held constant, right? Because here we're looking to the price being GDP deflator. As you can see, I'm going to keep pounding on that because it's extremely important. Okay, but now let's discuss, hey, why does this model has a somewhat flatter part of the aggregate supply, and why is it has a steeper part? Okay, as you can see, this is going to be connected a lot with the sensitivity of changes in GDP to changes in the aggregate price level. Okay, so let's understand how that works. Okay, so let's start with the steeper part, so closer to what is being highlighted here, so Y1, Y2. Okay, so let's pretend here that the economy is at Y1. Okay, the idea here is that, hey, if we want to promote more economic growth, if we want to be able to grow more, to produce more GDP, right, then we need to add more inputs to our production process. So more workers, right? You need to buy more inputs. You need to have more space in the factory. And as we know, what potential GDP, I apologize for that. What potential GDP is giving us is the level of production that is most efficient given the current economic scenario. And we know that, hey, this is probably where we should be to continue to grow efficiently over time. So we're not overgrowing, as we talked before, right? So the idea here is that, hey, if we want to increase production, trying to get to Y2, right, which would increase the level of GDP in an economy, okay, it would be really hard to be able to grow output. How? Everybody's employed, right? The unemployment rate is lower than what it should be. In terms, that means that there's a lot of people employed, and it's really hard to get more workers. So guess what starts to happen when you can't find workers, when you can't find any more machines? You start to bid up the price for those workers. You start to bid up the price for land, for those resources that you need for production processes, for the production process, right? If that's the case, you can now see that, hey, when Y is above potential GDP, when firms try to expand output, it's really hard to add inputs, okay? Which means that small changes in Y, when the current level of the economy is past potential GDP, will result in large changes in the price level. Why? Because now we have to bid up the price of those goods, of those inputs, to be able to generate more output. And when you increase the price of the wage level, right, and you're paying more wages and you're paying higher price for inputs, that ends up being translated to higher price level for the goods, the final goods of those companies. So that's the idea here. Okay, that's why it's steep, because of the lower sensitivity or the higher sensitivity of the price level to small changes in GDP when we're past potential GDP. Okay, so what's the reverse of that? Well, now you can imagine that, hey, if there's a reason, if we connected all those things to understand the steep side of this curve, let's understand the flat part as well, right? So as you can imagine, now if we're really far from where we want to be, hey, it's really, really easy to get workers to work for you. There's a lot of resources available, and it's easy. It's of easier access in terms of, hey, you don't need to bid up the price to get workers. In this case, the GDP gap is extremely negative, right? It's very negative, and there's a lot of workers that want to get jobs right now, right? This is that idea of a recession, for example. Okay, and in that case, we know, you can see here that it's not going to cost that much money to be able to increase production. It's going to be very cheap because a lot of people need jobs. And if that's the case, we have the inverse relationship here. Not in terms of flipping the sign, but just the sensitivity. So the sensitivity now to changes in Y leads to small changes in price level. Okay, so you can see, hey, I don't need to increase price that much to generate large changes in output. Okay, that's because there's a lot of resources that are available that can be cheaply added to the production process. Okay, so as you can see, a lot of this is going to depend on where the economy stands. Is it far from potential GDP? Is it close? Is it past potential GDP? And that's going to give us an idea about where the economy stands in terms of, hey, what type of policies do we need to implement to help the economy get where we want it to get, which is when it's equal to potential GDP. Or even a bigger question, how can we help potential GDP grow? All those things are going to be included in this chapter. Okay, so another way to think about this here, we're going to start to differentiate between short run versus long run. Okay, and as I already pointed out, it could be that we also want to be able to not only shift the aggregate supply curve, but also potential GDP. Okay, so one thing that I want to be able to make it clear here is that in economic theory, when we talk about short run, we talk about short periods of time, and there's certain things that we cannot change, right? For example, it's really hard to add more land and add a whole new factory to your firm, to your production process in a month. But is that feasible to do in 10 years? Yeah, it is a lot more feasible to do in 10 years. Okay, so we're gonna start thinking about, hey, instead of aggregate supply potential GDP, another names that we can give those gonna be short run aggregate supply and long run potential, long run aggregate supply. Okay, so that's another idea to think about this, is to start associating those two different curves, those two supply curves, with short versus long run as well. And let me know if that's not making sense for you yet, and we can definitely talk more about that in the virtual class. Okay, so now let's dive more to understand the aggregate demand curve, and then, as you know, we're going to put those together to find our equilibrium points and move on from that point on. Okay, so what is the aggregate demand curve in this case? Well, now we're going to talk about aggregating all the consumers, all the investors, all the government expenditure, the trade, everything that is into GDP in terms of the demand for its final goods. We're going to be able to be graphed here. Okay, so it's going to relate to the combinations of the price level and aggregate demand quantities in an economy. Okay, you might also see economists call this a planned expenditure. Okay, but that's not going to be that important for us and for this class. I'm more interested in for you guys to know what this means and how this impacts your life. Okay, especially that we're going to have a real life example in terms of the pandemic and how the government's stimulating the economy then. Okay, so let's think about how to model the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so the same idea, we're going to have real GDP on the x-axis and the price level, aggregate price level, which is the GDP deflator, the price level of all final goods and services produced within the US on the y-axis. Okay, so then as you can see, it's going to be graphed very similar to what we saw before, when we saw the demand on the first exam being for one market, but now we're going to look at expenditure for the entire US. So the demand for all final goods and services produced within the US, right? So let's think about, we already saw that the law of supply held, which is so cool, right? The same idea, as price level goes up, the price level of final goods goes up, overall production of real GDP goes up, tend to go up, right? Suppliers are more incentivized to produce more. Now the law of demand also applies in this macro perspective of this model as well, where, hey, as the price level goes up, we tend to buy less of those goods and services. Okay, and it's going to be the same idea here. As the aggregate price level goes up, we're going to buy less. We're going to demand less of final goods produced within the U.S. Okay, and we're going to discuss why and in more detail in a second as well. So don't worry. Okay, the first thing I want to point out is that, remember when I told you that GDP Formal is going to follow us? And it's because it's extremely important and helpful, and it's going to come back right now as well. Okay, so whenever you think about aggregate demand and you're trying to think, hey, what impacts the aggregate demand? Well, we already talked about those things, and that's the part that you can use it right now. Okay, so the aggregate demand in this case is going to be our GDP formula that we discussed before, where we have consumption related to household expenditures, investment related to firms' expenditures, government spending related to government expenditures, and we're going to also have net exports at the end, which you know is exports minus imports. Okay, so that's pretty much the definition of that curve here. So every time you think about aggregate demand, you can think Y equals to C plus I plus G plus NX. I'm not joking. It's useful. You can even write it down every time you see it so you can get used to it. Okay. Now let's understand. We know that the law of demand applies, and whenever we think about one good, it's very easy, right? Oh, if the price of beef goes up, Eddie, of course I'm going to buy less beef because I can buy chicken, right? Okay, that's fair. But what about when we talk about the price of all final goods produced within an economy, right? If the price of those goods go up, are you substituting? How? We're going to understand how that process works in this aggregate model. Okay, so there's three reasons why this curve is modeled this way: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the international trade effect. Okay, I'm going to dive more into those on the next video, so stay tuned.